You think lining up a tube makes you a soldier? She's just the Mortar girl. The jeers cut through the training ground, but Clara Hensley kept her grip firm, eyes unshaken. She was just aligning the mortar tube. At least that's what they thought. Then Major Donovan's command cracked the air. Stop! Remove your jacket! Fabric shifted, light struck metal, a hidden medal gleamed on her chest. The laughter collapsed into silence. The recruits froze, eyes wide, unsure of what they had just witnessed. And just as the field held its breath, an alarm siren wailed in the distance. What comes next will turn this drill into something no one expected. Where are you watching from? Comment below. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week, like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The heat of midday pressed down on the training ground at Camp Ironvale, turning the packed dirt into something that shimmered like metal underfoot. Dust floated in the air with every step of the recruits, clinging to sweat-soaked uniforms and stinging eyes. Orders barked from instructors bounced against the ridges surrounding the field, but among the shouts one figure knelt in silence at the edge of the mortar pit. Clara Hensley was on her knees, both hands steady on the long steel tube sunk into the earth. Her body leaned forward slightly, bracing, the way she had been taught in basic. Around her, the rest of the unit watched impatiently, shifting their weight, muttering, "You see her? That's all she does, lines it up and acts like it matters." A sneer cut through the crowd. Mortar girl, that's what she is, nothing more. Laughter followed, harsh and brittle. Boots scraped in the dirt as a few of them drifted closer, their grins wide, hungry for the reaction they assumed they'd provoke. But Clara did not look up. Her palms pressed against cold iron, fingertips finding familiar grooves. She adjusted the base plate a fraction, angled the barrel to the horizon, and breathed slowly. Another voice joined in, higher, mocking, careful now. "Don't strain yourself. Wouldn't want our precious tube keeper to chip a nail." More laughter. A hand flicked pebbles into the pit where she crouched. Still, her gaze never wavered. The weapon in front of her demanded accuracy, demanded calm. She gave it both, as though the jeers behind her belonged to some distant world. The instructor didn't interfere. Major Rowan Donovan stood with arms folded, a shadow against the glare, his eyes narrowed on Clara. To the recruits, he seemed indifferent, almost absent. But inside his mind, something was stirring. He had seen hundreds of trainees freeze under ridicule, stumble when the crowd turned cruel. This one did not. She was composed, as if the noise were wind rushing over stone. Her movements with the mortar were deliberate, exact. Too exact for someone with so little supposed experience. Just aligning a tube. Another voice scoffed. What a career. The jeers rolled again, yet Donovan caught something they missed, the way Clara. His jaw tightened, the rhythm of her breathing measured like a metronome. He had been in combat long enough to recognize discipline born of necessity, not classroom repetition. From where Clara knelt, the world narrowed to a ring of metal and the horizon beyond. She adjusted the bipod legs, anchoring them deeper, letting her weight settle into the motion. Her mind catalogued wind direction, the slope of the ground, the subtle vibration under her knees from distant artillery practice. All of it processed in silence. Then a sudden thump, the dull misfire of a nearby crew. A round hit the dirt too close, sending up a cloud of grit and choking smoke. The recruits shouted, stumbling back. Some cursed, others laughed nervously. But Clara simply reached out, steadied her own weapon, and angled it slightly away from the scatter. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. Donovan's eyes sharpened. Most would have jerked in panic. She hadn't moved like a startled novice. She had shifted with the precision of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done to maintain control. The noise died quickly, the misfire contained, but an uneasy silence lingered. Clara's hands, smudged with soil, clamped down on the tube one last time before she leaned back, waiting. Pathetic, a recruit muttered from behind. She acts like that's real soldiering. The insult might have carried further if not for Donovan's sudden step forward. His boots struck the ground like hammers. The laughter thinned instantly. He said nothing at first, only studied the woman crouched by the weapon, his face unreadable. Clara rose slowly, wiping dust across her sleeve. Her eyes flicked up just once, long enough to meet his. A current of recognition, or was it challenge, passed in that instant. Then her gaze dropped again. Donovan's stare held. He noticed something glint as she adjusted her jacket, a faint flash beneath the folds of fabric at her chest. His brow furrowed, a knot forming in his stomach. She tugged the cloth tighter, but the moment was already burned into his vision. Not a button, not a pin, but something heavier, sharper. He had seen medals in his years, commendations, badges of courage. This did not resemble any of those. The recruits didn't catch it, distracted by their own whispers, but Donovan had, and once seen, it could not be ignored. He stepped closer, voice low but firm. "Stop!" The chatter stilled, heads turned. Donovan's tone sliced through the humid air, cold and commanding. "Remove your jacket." For the first time that day, Clara hesitated. Not long, just enough for the silence to deepen. Her hand froze on the seam of her uniform. Around her, the recruits stiffened, curiosity blooming in the sudden quiet. Fabric shifted, heavy and reluctant. The outer layer peeled back inch by inch. Dust clung to the cloth as it slid off her shoulders. Then, caught in the sunlight, the gleam returned. This time undeniable, a medal. Not the common bronze circles pinned to the chests of parade soldiers, not the colored ribbons handed out in ceremonies. This was older, darker, its edges etched with symbols few here had ever seen. The laughter that had filled the air minutes earlier drained away as if the ground had swallowed it. The recruits gaped, their voices gone. Eyes darted from the medal to Donovan's face, searching for a clue, a reaction. Donovan's jaw tightened. He knew enough to recognize what should not exist. His breath caught, though he masked it with a cough. Clara did not look at them. She adjusted the mortar tube again, calm as ever, as if the secret pinned to her chest carried no weight at all. In that suspended silence, the only sound came from the wind brushing the dirt, carrying with it the faint tang of smoke from distant exercises. And then, like a knife slicing the moment in two, a siren howled across the camp. The recruits jolted, twisting toward the source. The alarm's shriek echoed off the walls, urgent, relentless. What had begun as a simple training exercise now trembled on the edge of something else entirely. Donovan's eyes never left Clara. She straightened slowly, dust on her hands, the medal catching sunlight one more time before vanishing under fabric. She was just aligning a mortar tube. Yet in that instant, every man and woman on that field knew. Nothing here was as simple as it seemed. The alarm wailed across Camp Iron Vale, a shriek so sharp it cut through every stray thought. Recruits who had been laughing seconds ago now turned pale, stumbling as they looked toward the horizon. The tone of the siren wasn't the usual drill cadence. It carried a pitch that rattled bones, a signal meant for danger, not rehearsal. Boots hammered against the ground as instructors shouted over the noise, herding trainees into rough formation, but order crumbled almost immediately. From the edge of the field, a black column of smoke coiled upward, thick and acrid, marking the sky with the promise of fire. It rose from the direction of the storage sheds where training munitions were kept. One of the younger soldiers dropped his pack and muttered, "This isn't scheduled. That's real." His words spread like sparks in dry grass. Fear multiplied. In the middle of it all, Clara Hensley stood near her mortar tube, the medal hidden once more beneath her jacket. Her breathing slowed, not sped up, her expression unreadable. She scanned the chaos, the recruits scattering, the instructors trying to restore order, the fire climbing higher. Her jaw clenched, and then she moved. She didn't wait for permission. She sprinted forward, voice rising clear and commanding, slicing through the panic. "Form on me! Keep the line tight! We control this ground, or the flames will eat it!" The sheer force of her tone startled several recruits into motion. They glanced at each other, torn between instinct to flee and the authority threading her words. In the absence of confidence from their instructors, they chose her. Clara led them toward the smoke. Heat washed over as they neared, the crackle of igniting wood swelling into a roar. One shed door had already collapsed, spilling sparks into the dirt. Ammunition crates stacked inside popped like firecrackers as the heat licked closer. "Grab sandbags! Build a barrier here!" she barked, pointing toward the path where the blaze could spread toward the training field. Her commands carried the weight of experience, and though most had never taken her seriously before, now they obeyed without question. Hands dug into the earth, hauling heavy sacks, slamming them down in rows. Clara bent low, dragging one herself, muscles straining. Her hair clung damp to her temples, but her eyes never left the growing fire line. Major Donovan pushed through the crowd, barking orders of his own. "Get back! This area is compromised!" But the recruits were already moving under Clara's lead, their fear replaced by urgency. He stopped short, watching as she directed them with precision no handbook could teach. Another explosion rippled from inside the shed, rattling the ground. A crate split, flinging fragments across the dirt. Clara shielded her face, then spun to the nearest cluster of soldiers. "Stay low! Keep your heads down and keep moving!" They did. The line of recruits thickened, forming a crude wall of sand and grit. Sweat poured down their faces, but there was a strange energy among them. Now, not panic, but focus, borrowed from the steadiness in her stance. Donovan's lips pressed tight. He wanted to pull her out, to assert his rank, yet he couldn't deny the results unfolding before him. Under her lead, the once disorganized mass of trainees had found direction. Another shed caught, a plume of flame twisting into the sky. Clara's gaze flicked toward the wind, measuring its push. She grabbed a flare from the supply crate at her feet, snapped it to life, and hurled it into the dirt between the fire and the recruits. Red smoke blossomed, thick and curling, drifting across the line like a curtain. "That's our shield!" she shouted. "Stay behind it, keep stacking." The crimson haze cloaked them, cutting visibility but blocking the worst of the heat. Recruits coughed, but they held their ground, sandbags thudding into place. From the other side of the smoke, instructors finally rallied, hauling hoses and shouting into radios. But the first wall had been made, and it had been Clara's doing. Donovan stepped into the haze, his silhouette stark against the fire's glow. He stopped a pace from her, voice taut. "Hensley, what the hell are you doing?" Her reply was clipped, sharp. "Saving your camp." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked through the veil of smoke. He saw no fear in hers, only determination sharpened by something deeper than ordinary training. Behind them, the blaze cracked louder, devouring timber. The recruits redoubled their efforts, inspired by the woman who had moments ago been nothing but a target for ridicule. Then came a shout from the far side of the grounds. "The flames are reaching the second row of sheds!" Clara spun toward the voice, her boots digging into the dirt. She raised her arm, rallying those nearest. "Split the line! Half with me, half hold the wall. Move!" They obeyed instantly. She charged ahead, a wedge of recruits following into the smoke. Their shadows flickered against orange light as they dragged hoses and overturned barrels to smother sparks leaping across the grass. Donovan followed slower, conflicted. Every instinct screamed that she had overstepped, yet the evidence was undeniable. Without her, the field would have been overrun already. A sudden gust drove embers across the ground, scattering like stars. Clara dropped, rolling a sandbag over the nearest patch, stamping it out. Her shoulders heaved, but she rose again, voice steady. "Don't let it jump! Cut it here!" The recruits mirrored her, stomping and smothering until the embers hissed into silence. For a moment hope sparked, but then the largest blast yet erupted from the first shed, a thunderous crack that threw a shockwave across the field. The recruits hit the ground. Clara staggered but stayed upright, shielding a younger soldier behind her. The smoke tore open with the blast, revealing the chaos in stark relief. Fire raging, out of control, supplies collapsing, and the line of trainees stretched thin. Donovan's jaw hardened. He barked into his radio for reinforcements, but he knew they wouldn't arrive in time to make the difference. His eyes cut back to Clara, her face streaked with ash, her hands raw from hauling sandbags, and something inside him shifted. This was no accident of composure. This was muscle memory, the reflexes of someone who had lived in fire before. He remembered that flash beneath her jacket, the metal glimpsed in sunlight. His mind connected the pieces he wished he could ignore. Clara shouted again, her voice ragged but fierce. "Hold your ground!" The wall holds, or the camp falls. The words rang with more than desperation. They carried conviction, the kind that forces people to stand when every instinct tells them to run. The recruits rose, coughing, eyes stinging, but they lifted sandbags, hauled hoses, fought as if their lives depended on it, because now they did. The fire line shuddered, slowed. The smoke curtain thickened as more flares were struck, spreading color across the choking air. Against all odds, the chaos was bending into something like order, and Donovan, standing in the heart of it, felt the weight of revelation pressing against him. Clara Hensley was not what she seemed. She was leading like a veteran officer, not a recruit, and the truth hidden under her uniform threatened to ignite a blaze even fiercer than the one devouring the sheds. The siren still screamed, the flames still clawed at the sky, but in that moment the entire camp seemed balanced. On a knife's edge, between ruin and survival, between lies and the truth that refused to stay buried. And Clara stood at the center of it all, the so-called Mortar girl, commanding. Through smoke and fire, as if the battlefield had always been hers. The roar of the last explosion rolled across Camp Ironvale, echoing like thunder trapped in the ridges. Dirt still rained down on helmets and shoulders. Recruits coughed in the haze, their lungs rasping as they tried to stay low. The wall of smoke from Clara's flares rippled in the wind, staining everything a deep crimson. It felt as if the sky itself had been painted in warning. Clara's voice cut through the choking air again, driving her makeshift line forward. "Reinforce the barrier! Keep the break sealed!" Her throat was raw, but her tone carried a weight that pressed men into action. They obeyed her without question now. Gone was the jeering, the mockery. Every eye that found her face carried urgency, even respect. Major Donovan stood a few yards back, his boots planted in churned earth, arms rigid at his sides. He was a man accustomed to control, to commanding every moving part of a battlefield exercise. Yet here, the chaos had bent toward another center of gravity, and it wasn't him. The recruits listened to her, not to his shouts, and worse, she was making it work. The blaze clawed at the second row of sheds, flames spitting sparks across the packed dirt. Each ember threatened to catch on fabric or wood. Clara snapped quick orders, sending half her line forward with buckets of water, while the others stayed fixed to the sandbag wall. She moved among them, dragging her own weight, sweat streaking across soot-stained skin. Her motions were efficient, nothing wasted. One recruit stumbled under a heavy load, nearly collapsing. Clara caught his arm, pulled him upright and shoved him toward the line again with a firm nod. "You're fine, keep moving." The boy's eyes widened as if shocked by her steadiness. Then he tightened his grip and ran on. Donovan clenched his jaw. He wanted to pull her out, strip her command, remind everyone of the chain of authority. Yet each second that passed without her would mean another hole in their defense. He recognized the truth. Even if he hated it, the camp was holding because of her. The fire cracked again, collapsing another shed wall. The blast of heat slammed into them like a wave. Clara ducked, eyes narrowing, then barked, "Shift the line to the left! Don't let it spread!" Her instincts were flawless, too flawless. Donovan's gut twisted as the memory of that medal flared again in his mind. This wasn't luck. This wasn't improvisation. She was drawing from a past none of these recruits could fathom. From the far side of the grounds came the sound of engines and the screech of brakes. Reinforcement crews poured in, dragging hoses, axes, and chemical extinguishers. At last, official aid had arrived, and the tension on the field shifted. But even as they stormed into the blaze, their eyes fell on Clara, noting her stance, the way she directed bodies into place as if she were one of their own officers. "Who's in charge here?" One firefighter yelled through his mask. Donovan should have answered. Instead, Clara gestured, pointing to the weak spots in the fire line, rattling off precise instructions. The firefighter didn't hesitate. He sprinted where she directed, his team following. That was the moment Donovan felt the ground tilt. A private, just a recruit, was now steering trained professionals in the middle of an emergency, and none of them questioned her. The effort dragged on, a grinding battle against an enemy that refused to die. Buckets emptied, hoses hissed, sandbags slammed into place until the line thickened. Hour by hour, the flames shrank, beaten back from the sheds into smoldering heaps. The siren wailed still, but the pitch softened as control slowly returned. At last, smoke thinned enough to reveal the field again. Recruits leaned on shovels, buckets, and one another, chests heaving. The fire no longer threatened to consume the camp. The worst had passed, but Donovan's gaze wasn't on the charred ground. It was on Clara. She stood at the front of the exhausted line, shoulders squared, soot streaking her face. She looked less like a trainee than a commander surveying the aftermath of battle. And when she exhaled, the weight in that breath wasn't relief. It was recognition, as if she'd stood in this place many times before. The recruits began to murmur. Words of awe spread where once there had been scorn. A few clapped her on the shoulder as they passed, their eyes lingering on her in a way they never had earlier. The mocking nickname, Mortar Girl, vanished from their lips, replaced by silence, tinged with reverence. Donovan stepped forward, his presence pulling the attention back to him. He stopped only a pace from Clara, close enough to see the ash clinging to her lashes. His voice was quiet but iron-hard. "In my office, now." The recruits glanced at each other, uncertain. Clara didn't argue. She simply gave one last instruction to the nearest soldier. "Check the wall. Make sure no gaps remain," before walking toward Donovan without hesitation. The two disappeared from the smoke-stained yard the recruits left behind, whispering, their curiosity mounting like pressure in a sealed chamber. Inside the command post, the air was cooler, filtered, carrying none of the smoke that had choked the training ground. Donovan closed the door behind them with a snap. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with unspoken questions. Clara stood at attention without being told, her uniform grimy, but her posture unwavering. Donovan circled her slowly, his eyes raking over every detail. Finally, he stopped in front of her, arms crossed. "You're going to explain," he said. "Right now." Her expression didn't change. "Explain what, sir?" His voice dropped to a near growl. "Don't play dumb with me. You gave commands out there like a field officer. You handled that fire like a combat operation. And then there's this." He jabbed a finger at her chest where the medal had gleamed earlier. "I saw it. That insignia doesn't exist. Not officially." "Not anymore." Her eyes flickered just for an instant. She drew in a breath, held it, then let it go. "You're mistaken," she said softly. "Don't insult me," Donovan snapped. "I served long enough to recognize what I saw. That symbol belonged to a unit that was erased from records years ago. Phantom Legion." The name hung between them, heavy, forbidden. Clara's silence was confirmation enough. Donovan stepped closer. "Who are you, Hensley? And how the hell did you end up here, hiding in plain sight?" Her jaw clenched, but still she didn't speak. The stillness stretched until Donovan slammed a hand on the desk between them, the crack echoing through the room. "You owe me the truth," he barked, "because right now my recruits follow you more than me, and if that's going to happen, I need to know why." Clara lifted her chin slowly. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I didn't come here to lead. I came here to disappear. That's all." Her words landed like stones dropped in water, rippling through Donovan's mind. To disappear? Soldiers didn't vanish into anonymity by accident, especially not ones carrying medals that had been buried with classified files. He stared at her, searching for cracks in her composure. Instead, he found only resolve, tired, hardened, but unbreakable. At last, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, "not by a long shot. You may think you can hide in the ranks, but after today, everyone saw what you're capable of, and I'm not the only one who recognized it." Outside, the camp still buzzed with recovery. Engines growled, hoses hissed, and recruits whispered about the woman who had turned chaos into order. Inside, Donovan's office felt like a chamber of secrets, the weight of revelation pressing in on both of them. Clara didn't respond. She stood silent, shoulders squared, eyes forward, a soldier's mask firmly in place. But beneath that stillness was the spark of something dangerous. A past, clawing its way back to the surface, whether she wanted it or not. And Donovan knew the fire outside had been extinguished, but a different blaze had been lit here, one that no amount of water could put out. The camp had quieted, but only on the surface. Ash still drifted on the breeze, carrying the faint smell of burned wood and scorched paint. Outside, recruits moved in subdued clusters, repairing the scorched ground, their voices low, restless. They kept glancing toward the command post where Clara Hensley had vanished with Major Donovan. Rumors already swirled, half-whispered stories about how she had held the line when the flames broke, loose, about the strange insignia that had flashed once on her chest before disappearing again. Inside the office, the tension hadn't faded. It had grown sharper, compact, filling the corners of the room. Donovan leaned against his desk, arms folded, his eyes never leaving Clara. She stood as if carved from stone, hands at her sides, uniform streaked with soot, but her bearing unchanged. The silence stretched, neither willing to surrender the next word easily. Finally Donovan spoke, his voice lower than before, deliberate. "You said you came here to disappear. That doesn't happen by chance. People don't stumble into a place like this with a past carved into their chest." He tapped a finger once on the desk, as if each word was a nail being hammered into place. "So I'll ask again, who are you really?" Clara's gaze lifted, meeting his with calm defiance. For a long moment it seemed she might refuse again, but the question lingered too heavy between them, and at last she exhaled, her shoulders softening by a fraction. "I was part of something that doesn't exist anymore," she said quietly, "an assignment buried so deep it might as well have been erased. That medal? It's not supposed to see daylight. Not here. Not anywhere." Donovan's jaw tightened. Phantom Legion. He said it like a curse, each syllable edged with disbelief. Her silence confirmed it more clearly than words. He pushed off the desk and circled her slowly. "I read the files. What little wasn't redacted. Your unit was trained for operations no one would ever admit happened. You shouldn't be standing in my camp wearing a recruit's patch, pretending you're another green soldier. So why are you?" Clara's eyes flicked downward as if weighing what she dared reveal. "Because sometimes surviving means vanishing," she murmured. "I thought if I blended in, kept my head down, I could live quietly. But today..." She trailed off, the memory of fire and chaos filling the gap. Donovan pressed, "Today, you showed them all you're more than that. You can't hide anymore. The recruits follow you now. They'll talk. They already are." Outside, muffled laughter and murmurs seeped through the walls. Every voice carried her name now, reshaping it with awe instead of mockery. Clara closed her eyes briefly, hearing it too. When she opened them, resolve had returned. "Then let them talk," she said. "I'll keep doing my work. That's all I came for." Donovan shook his head slowly. "No, you can't just bury this. That fire was one thing. But if word spreads about what you carry, this camp will become something else entirely. Questions will come from above. And you and I both know what happens when command catches a scent of something they buried." Clara's hands curled slightly into fists at her sides. She knew. She had lived it before. The door banged open suddenly. A figure stepped in without knocking. Lieutenant Keller, his face still, streaked with grime from the fire, eyes sharp with recognition. He froze when he saw Clara standing there. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Keller's voice cracked the silence, rough and certain. "It's her." His eyes fixed on the spot where the medal had been. His breath quickened. "That insignia! There's no mistake! Phantom Legion!" Donovan's glare snapped to him. "That's enough, Keller." But Keller's gaze never left Clara. His hands trembled slightly as memories washed over him, dragging ghosts into the room. "I saw that emblem once before, years ago. A briefing I wasn't supposed to attend. They said the unit was wiped out. Every last one. And yet," his voice broke, "you're standing here." Clara didn't flinch. Her voice stayed steady. "You should forget what you think you know." Keller laughed harshly. Disbelief etched across his features. "Forget? How do you forget seeing a ghost walk into your camp?" "They'll want answers, Donovan. You can't hide this." The Major's hand slammed against the desk again, silencing him. "Get out!" But Keller lingered a moment longer, eyes burning into Clara. "The Legion isn't dead," he whispered, half in awe, half in fear. "And if she's here, then nothing we thought was buried ever stayed buried." Then he turned and stormed out, the door crashing behind him. The office fell silent once more, but the damage was done. Donovan's face was carved in grim lines. Clara stood unmoving, though inside her thoughts raced. If Keller recognized her, others might too. The cover she had clung to was fraying faster than she could mend it. Donovan exhaled heavily. This is spiraling. If Keller runs his mouth, command will come down on us. And when they do, they won't just ask questions. They'll drag you back into whatever hole they pulled you from. Clara's eyes hardened. Then I'll do what I've always done. Adapt, survive. Donovan stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You're not making this easier for either of us. Outside, footsteps thundered as recruits shifted to new tasks, but their voices rose now with a different tone. Clara could hear it. Fragments of her name, spoken with reverence, even awe. The sound cut her deeper than insults ever had. She turned back to Donovan. You said I can't hide anymore. Maybe you're right, but that doesn't mean I have to let them own me again. His eyes narrowed. You think you can fight both the camp's rumor mill and the weight of classified history? That medal alone could topple your disguise. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It's just metal. What matters is what I choose now. The conversation ended there, heavy with unfinished edges. Donovan moved to the window, staring out at the recruits gathered in the yard there, faces still lit with the fire's reflection, even though the flames had died. Clara remained rigid, a figure of quiet defiance in the middle of his office. For the first time since the alarm had sounded, the Major felt something colder than smoke. Curling around his thoughts, a realization that the true blaze had only just begun. Clara Hensley was no longer invisible. She was a spark dropped into dry tinder, and the camp around her was, already beginning to burn in ways no hose or sandbag could control. And outside, whispers carried her name like a banner, growing louder with every passing minute. The camp didn't sleep that night, though the flames had been smothered and the alarm silenced. Long after the last hose was reeled in, conversations buzzed in hushed corners. Recruits gathered in small circles, replaying every command they had heard shouted during the fire. Her name slipped across lips with newfound weight. Clara Hensley, no longer just the quiet one crouched by a mortar tube. She had become the question mark at the heart of Camp Ironvale. At dawn, the yard bore scars of the blaze. Charred beams lay twisted like blackened bones, the smell of smoke still clinging to the air. Soldiers moved through the wreckage with shovels and tools, their chatter subdued but persistent. Every so often, one of them would glance toward the barracks where Clara had retreated, their eyes filled with something between admiration and unease. Inside, Clara sat on her bunk, hands clasped loosely between her knees. Her uniform, cleaned hastily, still carried faint smudges of ash. Around her, recruits stole quick looks, whispering behind cupped hands. She could feel their stares even without meeting their eyes. Some held curiosity, others suspicion, but all of them had changed. They no longer dismissed her. They waited, as if expecting her to act again when the next crisis struck. Donovan entered the barracks without warning. His presence cut conversation short, like a blade slicing through fabric. His gaze swept the room once before settling on her. Outside, he ordered, voice flat. Clara rose without a word. The recruits parted for her as she followed him out into the morning air. The camp stretched quiet before them, the rising sun bleeding pale light over the smoking ruins. Donovan stopped near the edge of the parade ground. His hands rested on his hips, his jaw rigid. Keller's already filed a report, he said. He claims he saw the insignia himself. I shut him down, but it won't hold. Someone higher up will come sniffing. Clara's expression didn't flicker. Then let them. That's not an option, Donovan snapped. "You don't understand. Phantom Legion isn't a name you toss around lightly. It was erased for a reason, and if they believe one of its ghosts has reappeared, they'll tear this place apart to confirm it." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "So what's your plan, Major? Hide me? Hand me over?" His silence said enough. The tension hung until voices carried across the yard. A group of recruits jogged past, saluting as they caught sight of Donovan, but their eyes slid to Clara, lingering, filled with questions they dared not speak aloud. One of them muttered, too low for the Major to catch, but clear enough for her, Legion. The word struck like a spark in dry grass. She felt it spread, carried on whispers, threading itself into the very air of the camp. Later that day, Donovan assembled the recruits in the charred yard. The ground was blackened, the sky clear. He addressed them with his usual authority, outlining the steps for rebuilding and discipline. Yet throughout his speech, Clara noticed how their attention drifted, not away, but toward her. Every pause seemed to pull their gazes in her direction, as though they waited for her to speak instead. When he dismissed them, 2 young soldiers lingered. One, still shaken from the fire, approached her directly. "Hensley," he said, his voice respectful now. "Back there, how did you know what to do? Nobody else could have commanded like that." Clara met his eyes evenly. "You don't need to know how," she said. "You only need to remember that you stood your ground." The boy nodded quickly, as though accepting a lesson before hurrying away. His companion whispered something excitedly as they disappeared. Clara knew the story would grow taller with every retelling. That evening, the officers gathered in the strategy tent. The atmosphere bristled with unease. Maps of the camp lay pinned to the table, dotted with notes about the fire, but the conversation kept drifting back to her name. Donovan stood at the head, trying to redirect them, but suspicion was alive in the room. "She took charge," one captain said. "The recruits followed her, not us." "That isn't normal." "She carries something," Keller added sharply, his eyes flicking to Donovan. "I saw it. I know what I saw." Donovan's jaw clenched, but before he could reply, another officer leaned forward. "Then what's she doing here, disguised as a recruit? Either she's lying to all of us, or someone higher up planted her for reasons we're not told." The debate swelled, accusations circling like vultures. Donovan finally slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! She saved your camp yesterday. Without her, you'd be digging graves right now. Whatever she was, she's here now. And until I get orders otherwise, she's under my command. Do you understand?" The room fell into uneasy silence. No one spoke further, but their eyes carried doubt that would not be silenced by his words alone. Meanwhile, Clara sat alone outside the tent, listening to the muffled arguments through the canvas. Her shoulders stiffened with each fragment she caught, Legion, medal, planted. The ghosts she had tried to bury were clawing their way into the open. As dusk fell, a messenger arrived at the camp. Dust coated his boots, his uniform stiff from the road. He carried a sealed envelope marked with the insignia of Central Command. Donovan broke the wax in private, scanning the page. His face hardened further with each line. By the time Clara was summoned, night had crept across the yard. Lanterns glowed faintly, casting shadows long and sharp. Donovan stood waiting, the letter folded in his fist. "They know," he said simply. "Headquarters received Keller's report. They're sending an envoy tomorrow. They want you brought before them for questioning." Clara didn't flinch. She only asked, "And if I refuse?" Donovan's stare held hers. "Then they'll come for you anyway, and they won't be gentle." The words settled like lead. She turned her face toward the horizon, where the faint glow of stars blinked through the smoke-stained air. For years, she had outrun her past by staying quiet, by blending into the background. Now silence was no shield. Behind her, recruits moved in the shadows, repairing damaged sheds, whispering her name under their breath. She heard it rise and fall like a chant, uncoordinated but insistent. It struck her that no matter what she chose, the camp had already begun to see her differently. Donovan's voice cut back through the night. "You need to decide, Hensley. Tomorrow, when they arrive, you can go in shackles, or you can face them standing tall. But one way or another, this secret isn't staying buried." The wind stirred ash from the blackened ground, lifting it in small spirals. Clara's eyes stayed on the horizon, her jaw set. The flames of yesterday had died, but another fire was coming, one she could not smother with sandbags or smoke. For the first time since she arrived at Camp Ironvale, Clara understood that hiding was no longer possible. The choice now was not whether her past would surface, but how she would meet it when it did. The morning broke heavy, the sky over Camp Ironvale veiled with a dull haze that refused to burn away. Soldiers lined the parade ground with tighter posture than usual, boots aligned in. Precise rows, eyes darting nervously toward the road that wound through the hills. Word had spread. An envoy from command was coming. Not rumor anymore, but certainty. Clara walked out of the barracks into that tension, her uniform clean but still bearing faint. Smudges near the cuffs. Reminders of ash that had clung to her skin only a day earlier. As she crossed the yard, conversations died mid-sentence. The recruits parted instinctively, not with jeers as they once had, but with silence heavy as stone. Their gazes followed her steps, searching for some clue of what she would do when the outsiders arrived. Donovan waited near the flagpole, hands clasped behind his back, his face carved with fatigue. He hadn't slept. Clara could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes, but his stance was rigid, unyielding. When she approached, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "They'll try to break you down fast," he murmured. "They'll use authority, intimidation, maybe worse. Whatever you say will decide what happens to you, and to this camp." She met his eyes, her voice low but firm. "And what if silence is the only thing that keeps me alive?" Before he could answer, engines growled in the distance. A convoy appeared at the crest of the hill, dark vehicles rolling in formation. Dust rose in their wake, blurring the edges of steel until they braked sharply at the gate. The camp seemed to shrink around the sound. The lead car door opened, and a tall officer stepped out. His uniform was immaculate, every crease pressed sharp, his insignia glinting even in the muted light. Colonel Eric Sloan, sent directly from Central Command. His reputation preceded him, a man known for uncovering secrets no one wanted unearthed. Sloan's eyes swept the assembly before landing on Clara. He didn't bother with introductions. He simply raised a hand and beckoned. "Bring her forward!" Two soldiers from his escort moved, but Donovan blocked them with a raised arm. "She walks on her own." The colonel's gaze flicked to him, then back to Clara. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, humorless. "Very well. Let's hear from the woman who saved your camp." Every step Clara took toward him echoed louder than it should have. Her boots, striking the parade ground as though the earth itself had become an amplifier. When she halted in front of Sloan, he studied her as if she were a specimen under glass. "You wear the face of a recruit," he said evenly, "but reports tell me you commanded yesterday like someone who's seen fire before. And then there's the matter of an emblem." His eyes narrowed. "Lift your jacket." The parade ground held its breath. Clara hesitated, then unfastened the top button, pulling the fabric aside. The medal caught the light, a flash of forbidden steel. Gasps rippled through the gathered soldiers. Sloane's expression hardened. Phantom Legion. The name lives only in classified files, and even there it's redacted to nothing. That program was dismantled. No survivors. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a blade's whisper. And yet here you are. Clara's heartbeat drummed steady against her ribs, but her voice emerged calm. I didn't come here to be found. I came to serve quietly, to vanish into ranks where no one would care. Impossible, Sloane replied. Men don't follow ghosts unless the ghost still breathes power. Yesterday, they followed you. Whispers stirred across the ground, recruits shifting uneasily. Donovan remained silent, jaw rigid, his fists at his sides. Sloane tilted his head, circling her. You have two paths, Hensley. Admit who you are and return with me, your history dragged into daylight, or deny it and watch me dismantle this camp to uncover the truth myself. Clara lifted her chin. You mistake me for a threat. I'm not here to resurrect the past. Every ghost is a threat, Sloane said, especially one that still commands the living. The words cut the air sharper than any blade. Then, before either could speak further, a voice broke from the crowd. It was one of the younger recruits, the same boy Clara had pulled to his feet during the fire. She saved us, he shouted, trembling but resolute. If she hadn't taken charge, half of us would have burned. You weren't here. We were. The silence that followed was thicker than the smoke had been. Sloane's eyes flicked toward the boy, then swept over the recruits, gauging their faces. He saw loyalty etched there, raw and unpolished, but dangerous all the same. A ripple of agreement passed among them, subtle but unmistakable. Clara turned slightly, her gaze moving over the line of young soldiers, who now stared back at her, not with suspicion but with conviction. Something shifted inside her chest, heavy and undeniable. She could no longer pretend to be invisible. Sloane's voice returned, cold. So that's it. They already believe. Whether you like it or not, the Legion lives through you. Donovan stepped forward at last, his tone sharp. Enough? If Command wants answers, you'll take them from me, not from someone who earned this camp's respect by saving lives. But Sloane only smiled faintly. Respect is fickle, fear is permanent, and fear will decide how this ends. He turned back to Clara, his gaze like iron. Tonight you will come with us. If you resist, I'll ensure this entire camp is punished for your defiance. The recruits stiffened, outrage flickering across their faces, but Clara lifted a hand slightly, silencing them before they spoke. Her voice was clear, ringing across the yard. If going with you keeps them safe, I'll go. The words landed heavy. Donovan's head snapped toward her, disbelief flashing in his eyes, but she held his stare calmly. The colonel nodded once. Wise. He gestured to his escort. Prepare transport. At dusk, the vehicles growled to life again, engines rumbling like beasts waiting to devour. The recruits remained frozen, watching Clara as if she were being carried toward execution. She gave them no sign of fear, only the same unshakable steadiness she had shown when fire raged around them. When Sloane finally turned away, Donovan caught her arm, his grip firm. This isn't over, he muttered fiercely. You're not walking into their hands without a fight. Not if I can stop it. Clara met his gaze, and though her face remained calm, her words carried quiet steel. Then be ready, because once they take me, the truth won't stay buried anymore. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened, and the camp braced for a confrontation none of them had trained for. The fire they had survived was only a prelude. The real battle, one fought not with flames, but with secrets and power, was waiting at nightfall. Dusk crept over Camp Ironvale with a weight heavier than the smoke from the ruined sheds. The sky burned in streaks of rust and violet, the kind of light that promised endings. Vehicles from the envoy sat idling at the edge of the parade ground, their engines grumbling like predators waiting to pounce. Soldiers from command leaned against armored doors, rifles slung, eyes sweeping the camp with bored authority. Among the recruits, unease pulsed like a heartbeat. They had spent the day repairing fences and shoveling charred rubble, but their thoughts were elsewhere. Every glance circled back to the woman who had once been invisible among them and now stood at the center of everything. Clara Hensley had changed from the Mortar girl to something far more complicated, a symbol, though no one could agree of what. She waited in the open yard, hands loose at her sides. Her uniform, pressed clean again, caught the fading light. She looked neither defeated nor triumphant, simply resolved. Every so often, whispers stirred around her, voices of young soldiers, frightened, angry, unwilling to accept that she would be taken away like a criminal. Major Donovan paced a few feet behind her, his boots grinding grit into the ground. His composure was taut as wire, his eyes tracking every envoy guard. He had argued until his voice nearly cracked, but Sloane's order was absolute. Clara would leave with them at nightfall. The colonel appeared then, stepping out from the command tent as though the fading sunlight itself had been waiting for him. Sloane carried himself with a cold certainty, each movement precise, his expression unreadable. He looked at Clara the way one inspects a classified file, already convinced of its contents yet hungry to confirm the details. "Time," he said simply. Two of his men advanced. Recruits stiffened, murmurs rising, but Clara lifted her hand slightly, a gesture of quiet restraint. Her gaze never left Sloane's. "I'll walk," she said. "No need for shackles." The guards hesitated, glancing back at the colonel. He gave a faint nod, lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. "Pride until the end, I see." Clara moved forward, the sound of her boots echoing unnaturally loud across the gravel. The recruits parted, their eyes wide, shoulders squared in silent solidarity. Many of them clenched fists at their sides, but none dared move. The camp seemed suspended, holding its breath as she crossed into the shadow of the envoy's convoy. Then, unexpected, one voice rang out, "She saved us!" A recruit broke ranks, stepping forward, his chest heaving. "You can't just take her like this!" Another echoed him. Then another. Within moments, dozens of voices rose, shouting over each other, not in chaos, but in unity. The yard vibrated with their defiance. Clara stopped in her tracks, turning her head just enough to see them. Their faces were young, smeared with soot and fatigue, yet lit by conviction. Sloane raised a hand and his escort lifted rifles in response. The parade ground froze again, the sudden threat slicing through the air. Donovan's hand drifted toward his sidearm, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. Clara stepped between the lines before the standoff could ignite. Her voice cut across the noise, calm but forceful. "Enough. Stand down." The recruits faltered, torn between loyalty and discipline. Slowly, reluctantly, their voices faded. Weapons remained raised for a moment longer before Sloane lowered his hand and the rifles tilted back toward the dirt. The colonel studied her with interest, as though cataloguing her ability to command obedience with a single phrase. "Remarkable," he said softly. "Even now they would march into fire if you asked it." Clara's eyes hardened. They followed because no one else would lead when it mattered. "That doesn't make me your tool." Sloane's smirk widened. "That makes you dangerous." He motioned to the convoy. The rear door opened with a metallic creak, revealing the dim interior. Clara took one last look at the camp. The recruits holding themselves. Rigid, Donovan a storm barely contained, and then she stepped forward. But before she could climb inside, Donovan's voice cracked the night. "This isn't right." Sloane turned, his gaze sharp. "Careful, Major." Donovan moved closer, his voice louder now, directed at the recruits as much as at the envoy. "She's no traitor. Yesterday, when the fire threatened to swallow this camp, she saved it. You all saw it, and now they want to drag her away in silence. Ask yourselves why." The recruits shifted uneasily. A murmur rippled again, fiercer this time, anger bubbling at the edges. Clara shook her head, speaking low, meant only for Donovan. "Don't do this, not here. They'll suffer for it." But his voice carried anyway, stubborn and unyielding. "If command fears her so much, it's because they know what she represents. Not a ghost, but proof that what they tried to bury still lives." The colonel's hand lifted again, but before he could give the order, Clara placed herself squarely in the middle. She raised her voice to the recruits, steady and measured. "You owe me nothing. Do not risk your future on my past. Stand down, all of you." Her words landed heavy, pulling them back from the edge. One by one, shoulders slumped, fists unclenched. The camp fell into silence once more. Sloane's eyes glinted with cold triumph. "Good soldier," he said. Clara turned toward him fully, her tone ice. "I didn't say it for you." And with that, she climbed into the vehicle. The door slammed shut behind her, muffling the camp, leaving only the rumble of engines as the convoy prepared to depart. Donovan stood frozen, every fiber of his body screaming to act. The recruits looked at him, waiting, searching for direction. His fists opened and closed, the weight of responsibility crushing him. At last, he forced himself to stand rigid, watching as the vehicles rolled toward the gate, carrying Clara into the night. But in the eyes of the recruits, something irreversible had taken root. They had seen the Legion's shadow in her, and no amount of orders could erase it. As the taillights vanished into the dark, whispers began again, low, urgent, unstoppable. Clara was gone from Camp Ironvale, but her presence lingered like embers refusing to die. Every soldier who had followed her during the fire now carried a piece of that defiance in their chest. And Donovan knew, as he stood beneath the dimming sky, that this was not the end. It was the spark of a storm that command itself might never be able to contain. The convoy pushed into the night, its engines humming a low, relentless dirge. The road out of Camp Ironvale wound through blackened ridges, and the rhythmic thud of tires over uneven stone marked every mile Clara moved farther from the soldiers she had led. Inside the armored vehicle, the air was stifling. No windows, only dim red lights casting hard shadows across her face. Two guards sat opposite, rifles resting on their knees, eyes fixed on her as if staring long enough could keep her contained. Colonel Sloane sat beside her, relaxed in posture but sharp in gaze. He had barely spoken since she climbed aboard, choosing silence as his weapon. But when the camp's lights vanished behind them, he leaned closer. "You could have roused them," he said calmly. "One word and that camp would have risen against me, yet you told them to stand down. Why?" Clara met his eyes without blinking. "Because they're young. They deserve a chance to grow without being crushed by battles they don't understand." Sloane's lips curved faintly, pragmatic, almost noble. "But don't pretend it wasn't also self-preservation. You know as well as I do, if they'd resisted, I would have left bodies on the dirt." She said nothing. The truth was obvious enough. The convoy rolled on for hours, the terrain growing rougher, the road narrowing between jagged cliffs. The night pressed close, broken only by the faint gleam of headlights bouncing off stone. Clara sat motionless, her breathing steady, but her thoughts churned beneath the calm exterior. Every instinct told her that once they delivered her into Command's hands, there would be no more quiet existence, no more hiding among ordinary soldiers. She wasn't wrong. At a checkpoint cut into the ridge, the convoy slowed. Floodlights bathed the rock walls, revealing concrete bunkers and guards in heavier gear. Clara recognized the type of post. It wasn't just security, it was containment. Sloane gave a brief order, and the vehicles rolled through. Inside the fortified compound beyond the gate, she was escorted into a low building. The corridor smelled of oil and iron, the hum of generators vibrating through the walls. Doors clanged shut behind her, one after another, sealing her deeper into a place built to erase people quietly. In a stark chamber, she was ordered to sit at a steel table. Sloane remained standing, hands behind his back. "You know what comes next," he said evenly. "Interrogation. Deconstruction of identity. They'll want details you've kept buried. Missions, names, every shadow you ever walked in. Deny it if you like. The walls here don't forget." Clara leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "And what if there's nothing left to take from me?" Sloane studied her, the faintest trace of curiosity edging his otherwise cold demeanor. "There's always something left. Even silence tells its story." Before she could reply, the door burst open. A junior officer entered, pale and tense, a folder in hand. He passed it to Sloane with a trembling salute. The colonel flipped it open, scanning quickly. His expression darkened. He closed the file slowly, then turned to Clara. "Your friends at Iron Vale are less obedient than you thought." Clara's eyes narrowed. "What did they do?" Sloane tapped the folder. "Reports from scouts. Major Donovan is refusing to let this camp go quiet. He's sent messages beyond his rank, inquiries up the chain. Dangerous inquiries. He's putting himself at risk to drag light onto your shadow. Perhaps he doesn't trust me to handle you, or perhaps he's decided you're worth defying command for." A flicker crossed Clara's face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. She looked away, jaw tight. Sloane leaned closer, voice a murmur. "So you see, Hensley, even when you try to disappear, the world bends around you. You inspire obedience, yes, but also defiance. And that, more than any medal, is why you are dangerous." The interrogation that followed was methodical. They pressed her with questions, some sharp, some deceptively casual. They tried to corner her into contradictions, to make her stumble. Clara gave them nothing but fragments, answers vague enough to mean little, precise enough to avoid obvious lies. When they demanded details of the Legion, she deflected, insisting it was only rumor, myth inflated by frightened recruits. Hours bled away. By the time she was left alone, her body ached from the stiff chair, her throat raw from rationed words. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. In the silence, the faint echo of the camp came back to her. The recruits, shouting that she had saved them, Donovan's voice cracking with fury. It lingered longer than the interrogator's questions. Far away, Donovan was not silent. Back at Iron Vale, he stood in the center of the ruined yard. Recruits gathered around him. He had kept his tongue still for hours, weighing the weight of orders against the weight of conscience. But when the scouts confirmed the convoy had carried her into a classified compound, he could no longer hold. "She was taken because of who she is," he said, his voice ringing across the crowd. "But don't fool yourselves. What she is doesn't threaten this camp. It threatens the people who buried the truth and fear it rising again." Yesterday she proved herself when the fire nearly swallowed us, and now they want to erase her to keep us blind." The recruits listened in stunned silence, the twilight sky bruised above them. Some clenched their fists, others nodded slowly. A shift was happening, subtle but irreversible. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was solidarity. Clara's absence had turned into proof of everything whispered about her. Back in the compound, Clara's cell door scraped open again. Sloane appeared, hands clasped behind his back. "You've survived the first round. Impressive. Most break faster. But don't mistake endurance for victory. Tomorrow, higher eyes will turn to you. And once they do, your choices will narrow to nothing." Clara sat up, her gaze steady, voice quiet but unyielding. "You can chain me to walls, bury me in silence, strip me of name and rank. But what you fear isn't me. It's what happens when others decide they don't need your permission to follow." For the first time, the colonel's mask cracked slightly. He studied her in silence before leaving without a word, the door slamming behind him. Alone in the dark, Clara leaned back against cold stone, the echoes of Ironvale alive in her memory. She didn't know if she would ever see the camp again, but she knew one thing with certainty: what had started there was no longer hers to contain. And somewhere beyond these walls, Donovan and the recruits were already carrying that spark forward, whether she willed it or not. The night inside the compound was endless, its silence deeper than the dark. Clara sat upright against the cold wall, every muscle aching but her mind unbroken. The hum of distant generators seeped through the stone, constant and oppressive, as if reminding her that time belonged to someone else now. She closed her eyes briefly, hearing in memory the voices of recruits calling her name, the rising defiance at Ironvale. Those echoes were her only warmth in a place designed to erase it. At dawn, heavy footsteps approached, the door unlocked with a metallic groan. 2 guards entered, weapons held casually but with readiness. Behind them strode Colonel Sloane, his uniform immaculate, his face calm as if the long night had cost him nothing. He carried a folder tucked under one arm. "On your feet," he ordered. Clara rose without hesitation. She did not salute, did not speak. They marched her into a chamber brighter than the last, its walls gleaming steel, its table polished to a cold shine. At the far end sat 3 officers Clara didn't recognize, figures from beyond the camp, men and women who spoke for command itself. Their insignia carried weight that could crush a career with a gesture. Sloane placed the folder on the table, flipping it open with deliberate care. "This is Clara Hensley," he began, "recruit at Camp Ironvale. But as you've heard, there's reason to believe she isn't who she claims to be." He turned his eyes to Clara, sharp as glass. "She carries the mark of the Phantom Legion." The room shifted with the weight of the name. One of the officers leaned forward, fingers steepled. "That program does not exist," she said. Her voice was precise, clipped. Clara held her ground. "Then there's nothing for you to fear." A second officer, older, scar down his cheek, snorted. "Yet a camp of recruits would have burned without you. You commanded them like seasoned troops. Don't insult us with denial." Her silence spoke louder than words. The third officer, quiet until now, adjusted his spectacles and studied her face. "Tell me," he said softly, "why conceal yourself as an ordinary soldier? If you once wore that emblem, why not claim its legacy?" Clara met his gaze. "Because legacy is a chain. I didn't come to resurrect ghosts. I came to live among those who didn't know my past. That fire took the choice from me, nothing more." The scarred officer slammed his palm against the table. "Dangerous answer. You admit the medal is yours." Clara's voice remained calm. I admit nothing except that I stood where no one else would. Call it what you like." The three exchanged looks, a silent conversation laced with calculation. Finally, the woman at the center nodded to Sloane. "You've done well to bring her. But this is no ordinary recruit. She belongs under higher custody. Transfer her immediately." Sloane inclined his head, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. He closed the folder and signaled the guards. Clara was pulled to her feet again, wrists gripped tightly. As they led her back through the corridors, she caught fragments of conversation, echoing in her mind, words like custody, containment, asset. They weren't debating her innocence, they were deciding her use. Outside the chamber, Sloane walked beside her. "You see," he said quietly, "your fate is no longer in your hands. You try to hide, but you can't bury what you are. Others will always uncover it, and they will always want to own it." Clara's reply was steady. "I don't belong to anyone." His smirk returned. "You belong to the Legion's shadow. That is enough." But far from the compound, change was already stirring. At Camp Ironvale, Major Donovan stood before the recruits once more. His voice, usually measured, carried raw conviction now. They took her because she showed them the truth, that you don't need rank to lead, that courage isn't theirs to assign. They fear her not for what she's done, but for what she reminds them of, and I will not let them erase her. The recruits answered not with jeers or doubt, but with a unified roar. The sound rolled across the yard like thunder, rattling the charred ruins of the sheds. They were no longer scattered trainees. They had become a line, hardened by fire and bound by loyalty to the woman who had saved them. Donovan clenched his fists. "Then listen. If Command believes she's a danger, then so am I. We won't let them bury her alive in some forgotten cell. The choice was made. Scouts were dispatched. Supplies gathered quietly. Plans whispered under cover of night spread through the ranks. They would not wait for orders. They would act." Back in the compound, Clara was returned to her cell. The door clanged shut. She sat once more against the wall, her breathing even. But this time, a spark burned behind her stillness. She had seen the fear in those officers' eyes, the way the word Legion had unsettled them. They could strip her of freedom, but they could not control the ripples her presence had already unleashed. Hours passed. Guards patrolled in steady rhythm, the compound a machine of routine. But when midnight approached, the silence broke. An explosion cracked the outer wall, a tremor shaking through the corridors. Alarms screamed, boots thundered. Clara rose instantly, instincts alive. The cell door burst open, not with guards, but with familiar faces. Donovan pushed inside, rifle slung across his chest, eyes blazing. Behind him, two recruits Clara recognized from the fire at Ironvale, their hands trembling but determined. "We're not leaving you here," Donovan said, voice rough with urgency. Clara stared at him, stunned for only a moment. Then she shook her head. "You shouldn't have come. They'll crush you for this." "We're already past that," he snapped. "The moment you stepped into that convoy, none of us could go back." The compound shook again as another detonation rocked the far side. Smoke curled down the corridor. Voices shouted in panic. Clara stepped out of the cell, her eyes narrowing. "Then let's finish this quickly." The four of them moved as one, darting through the confusion. Gunfire cracked in the distance, but the compound was sprawling, its guards scattered by the sudden assault. Donovan led with practiced precision, signaling turns, keeping low. Clara followed, her movements smooth, instinctual, as though every step carried her back into the rhythm of a life she had tried to abandon. They reached a service tunnel, half hidden behind crates. Donovan shoved the hatch open. cold night air spilled in, thick with dust from collapsing stone. As they climbed out, Clara looked back once, her gaze hard. She knew this place would not forget her escape, neither would Sloane. But outside, under the vast night sky, recruits waited in the shadows, faces she had thought she would never see again. When she stepped into their midst, a murmur swept through them, not of disbelief, but of fierce relief. For the first time since the medal had glinted in sunlight, Clara allowed herself to breathe freely. The past had caught her, tried to cage her, but the fire at Iron Vale had changed everything. The soldiers she once hoped would never notice her had chosen to follow her into defiance. As the convoy's ruins smoldered behind them and the horizon opened ahead, Clara understood there was no hiding left. She was no longer just the woman who aligned a mortar tube. She was the spark they had chosen to keep alive. And the storm she had tried to outrun was no longer a threat in the distance. It was already burning into dawn with her at its center. The dust of the escape still hung in the air when the recruits closed. In around Clara, their faces lit not by firelight, but by conviction. She had fought to vanish, to blend into a world that never asked questions. But that choice was gone now. What remained was the undeniable truth. The Legion's shadow still walked, and it had a name. Her story was never about medals or secrecy, not even about the operations erased from history. It was about standing in the fire when everyone else fled. It was about reminding soldiers, young, frightened, untested, that courage is not something stamped onto a uniform or written in a file. It's forged in the moment you decide to hold your ground when the world tells you to break. At Camp Iron Vale, they would speak of the day a woman once dismissed as the Mortar girl became the center of gravity in a storm. They would remember how recruits who once mocked her found their strength in her steadiness. And they would remember that when command came to silence her, she walked forward without fear, choosing their safety over her own freedom. That is what transformed whispers into belief and belief into loyalty. Clara Hensley had tried to escape the weight of her past, but fate dragged it back into the light. And though she stood at the edge of exile, the truth could not be contained. Donovan's defiance, the recruits' unity, the defiant echo of her name through the night, all of it had already carried further than any file locked in a drawer. The Legion wasn't reborn in some secret chamber. It lived in every soldier who had seen her take command without permission, without rank, without hesitation. That is why stories like hers matter, because sometimes the most dangerous thing is not a weapon, not a classified program, not even a medal stamped with forbidden symbols. It is the example of one person who refuses to vanish when the world demands silence. And now it is your turn to carry it forward. What did you see in Clara's fight? Was it defiance? Was it duty? Was it survival? Tell us below, because your voice shapes how these stories live on. This is Veteran Biker, where the hidden battles are brought into the open, where the forgotten defenders are given their due. If you felt the fire of this story, subscribe and share so more eyes can see what truth looks like when it refuses to be buried. Thank you for watching, for riding with us through every spark and every silence. More stories are waiting, just beyond this screen at the edge of the next dawn. Stay with us and never forget, legends don't disappear. They rise when the world needs them most.